The 25th of October 1944, the Philippine sky above the Pacific. The air was thick with the roar of engines, but it wasn't the sound of a usual sortie. A Zero fighter locked onto its target, aiming its nose straight at a Hellcat, confident in its agility, speed, and reputation. The Zero had sliced through Allied squadrons for months, its pilots believing it could outrun anything the Americans had. But this time was different. The Hellcat's six 50 caliber guns spat a storm of bullets. In the blink of an eye, the Zero disintegrated, its wings ripped apart by the Hellcat's withering fire. A burst of flame from the engine sent debris spinning in the sky. The Zero never stood a chance. There was no radio call, no desperate maneuver, just the sound of shredded metal and the silent aftermath of a legend shattered. By the fall of 1944, the Empire of Japan found itself cornered, its once proud fleet of aircraft facing the full force of American air superiority. The months of relentless bombing campaigns, island hopping, and naval skirmishes had worn the Japanese forces thin. Fuel shortages, diminishing aircraft production, and a desperate need for trained pilots had crippled Japan's ability to sustain its offensive in the Pacific. The war was no longer in their favor, but they still held on to a dangerous myth, the Mitsubishi A6M0. To the Japanese pilots, the Zero was the unbeatable fighter, a symbol of their dominance in the skies. Its speed, maneuverability, and agility had made it the nightmare of American pilots early in the war. Even in the most intense dogfights, the Zero seemed invincible. Japanese aircrews had long since believed that nothing in the sky could match their prized fighter, a belief that ran deep in their psyche. But by late 1944, something had shifted. The U.S. Navy was no longer scrambling to catch up. The F-6F Hellcat, a newer, sturdier aircraft, had begun to turn the tide. Fast, reliable, and heavily armed, the Hellcat wasn't just another fighter, it was a system of air superiority built from the ground up. The Hellcat's powerful, 50 caliber machine guns, its durable airframe, and its ability to take damage and keep flying gave it an edge that the Zero simply couldn't compete with. What was once considered the best fighter in the world was now facing a new challenger, one that was no longer just surviving, but thriving in the air. The stakes could not have been higher. If the Hellcat's superiority was proven in combat, it would completely obliterate Japan's air ambitions and seal the fate of the war in the Pacific. The Zero's legacy would be shattered in the skies above, and with it, the hope of a Japanese victory. For American pilots, the stakes were equally high. They were no longer just trying to survive the constant onslaught of Japanese air raids. The Hellcat's success was critical to crushing Japanese morale, breaking their aerial dominance, and paving the way for the Allied invasion of Japan. The Hellcat was not just a symbol of military might, it was the key to the future. If the U.S. Navy could prove its superiority in the air, then Japan's myth of invulnerability would be wiped away, and the Allies would be one step closer to victory. In the skies above the Pacific, the battle wasn't just about planes. It was about the final shift in power, the moment the Zero's myth would collapse, and the Hellcat would rise as the new king of the skies. The outcome of these encounters would dictate the trajectory of the war, shaping the future of both nations and marking the beginning of the end for Japan's aerial supremacy. In the air over the Pacific, dogfights between the F-6F Hellcat and Mitsubishi A6M0 were not just a test of skill, but a battle between two fundamentally different philosophies of aircraft design. The Zero, agile and lightweight, had earned its place as the most feared fighter in the early years of the Pacific War. But the Hellcat, a more robust and purpose-built machine, was about to prove that survivability and firepower could outmatch sheer agility. The Zero was built for one purpose: to dominate in dogfights. Light, fast, and maneuverable, it was the ultimate fighter for close-quarters combat. Its design emphasized speed and agility, giving it the ability to outmaneuver most Allied aircraft. The Zero's lightweight airframe and powerful engine allowed it to perform dramatic, aerobatic maneuvers that could easily leave enemy pilots in the dust. Its armament, though less powerful than the Hellcats, was still sufficient to deal deadly blows to slower, less agile aircraft. In the first years of the war, the Zero's near invisibility in the sky and lightning-fast strikes made it nearly untouchable. But the Zero's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. Its lightweight design came at a cost: fragility. The Zero's thin, Unarmored skin and exposed fuel lines made it vulnerable to damage. One well-placed hit from a 50 caliber machine gun could be enough to send the aircraft spiraling out of control. And while the Zero could outturn most of its adversaries, it struggled with endurance. Its limited range and fragile frame meant that after a few exchanges in combat, it was often in need of quick repairs. The Zero's limited fuel capacity also meant that in long-range operations, it could not sustain the same level of combat effectiveness as more durable American aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, by contrast, was a purpose-built carrier fighter, designed with the lessons learned from previous American aircraft, such as the F-4F Wildcat. The Hellcat was made for endurance and firepower. At its core, the Hellcat was built to fight from aircraft carriers, meaning it needed to endure long flights, high-speed takeoffs and landings, and the harsh conditions of the Pacific. The Hellcat was a heavier, sturdier aircraft, but its robust airframe allowed it to take hits and keep flying. This was crucial in the high-risk, high-reward nature of carrier-based combat, where returning to base was as important as bringing down the enemy. The Hellcat's armament was one of its greatest assets. Equipped with 6 50 caliber machine guns mounted along the wings, the Hellcat had a staggering rate of fire that could tear through the delicate structure of the Zero in seconds. These guns packed enough punch to rip apart the Zero's light airframe before the enemy pilot even had a chance to react. In early combat engagements, American pilots quickly realized that while the Zero could outmaneuver them, the Hellcat could outgun and outlast it. The Hellcat's toughness was also a critical advantage. The Hellcat was designed to absorb damage and still return to base. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and armored cockpit offered protection against the kind of small arms fire and flak that would have sent a Zero crashing into the ocean. This resilience meant that even if a Hellcat pilot took a hit, they still had a chance of making it back to base, unlike the Zero, which often broke apart upon taking a single hit. One of the most crucial upgrades to the Hellcat was its engine. The Hellcat was powered by the Wright R1820 Cyclone engine, a radial engine that provided the Hellcat with excellent maneuverability and speed in its class. This engine, combined with the Hellcat's wing design, allowed for superior low-speed handling, which made it far easier to fly and control in combat than the Zero. But perhaps the most defining feature of the Hellcat was the U.S. Navy's training program. American pilots were put through grueling training exercises that prepared them for the types of dogfights they would encounter in the Pacific. Hellcat pilots were taught not only how to fight in the sky, but how to stay alive. Pilots learned to rely on the Hellcat's superior firepower and strength, rather than trying to match the Zero's agility in a drawn-out dogfight. The American strategy was simple: stay calm, stay focused, and let the Hellcat's capabilities do the work. This contrast in approach agility versus firepower would define the shifting balance of aerial power in the Pacific. The first engagements between the Hellcat and the Zero were telling. Early on, Zero pilots believed they could rely on their agility to evade the Hellcat's firepower. However, as more and more Hellcats entered the fight, the tide began to turn. The Zero's myth of invincibility started to crack. American pilots quickly discovered that with the Hellcat's superior weapons and durability, they could outlast the Zero's attacks and destroy it from a distance before the Japanese fighter could get close enough to strike. For the first time in the Pacific, the Zero's high-speed maneuvers were no longer the deciding factor in battle. The Hellcat was learning how to play a different game, and it was one that the Zero could not match. In the coming months, the Zero's record began to plummet, as the Hellcat's firepower and resilience started to dominate. What had once been considered the pinnacle of aerial design was now just a fading relic. The Zero could no longer claim supremacy, and its once unchallenged place in the Pacific sky was being eroded by the new king of the air, the F-6F Hellcat. As the F-6F Hellcat descended toward the jungle-laden skies of the Philippines, Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Walker gripped the controls, feeling the familiar hum of the engine beneath him. His mission was simple: take out as many Japanese planes as possible, stay on the offensive, and return to base. He had done this countless times before, but today, something was different. Today, it felt like the Zero was no longer the unbeatable force it once was. The radio crackled in his earpiece, the commander's voice steady and calm. Hellcats, form up. Enemy aircraft sighted. Target. Zeke. The name of the Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, sent a ripple of tension through the cockpit. The Zero had ruled the skies for years, its sleek design and superior maneuverability striking fear into even the most seasoned pilots. The Hellcat pilots, however, were no longer the underdogs. They had adapted and now stood at the cusp of rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Walker's heart rate ticked up as he followed the flight leader's instructions, forming up with the rest of the squadron. He was ready. He had been trained for this. Hellcat pilots had learned to survive, learned to stay calm in the chaos of combat. But there was always the expectation of battle, the hum of adrenaline, the focus of target acquisition, the constant anxiety of survival. And then, out of nowhere, the enemy appeared. The Zeros came into view from above, their distinctive, curving wings slicing through the sky like a fleet of hawks. Tommy's pulse quickened, his gaze sharpening as the enemy aircraft dove toward them. The Zero pilots were confident. They were still holding on to the myth that they could outrun anything that came their way. They would cut through the American fighters with ease. But Tommy had a different feeling today, one that had been building over the past few weeks. His training kicked in. The Zero was fast, yes, but the Hellcat's powerful 50 caliber machine guns had a reach and stopping power that the Zero couldn't escape. He could already feel the Hellcat's sturdy frame responding to his commands. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine hummed under him, and he steeled himself for what was about to come. The Zero pilot locked onto Tommy's tail, his eyes wide behind the cockpit as he maneuvered to get the shot. Tommy saw it coming. The Japanese pilot was determined to outturn him, to put him in the crosshairs and end the fight quickly. The first few seconds felt like slow motion. Tommy could almost predict the pilot's moves. He knew exactly what the Zero was capable of, and more importantly, he knew what it couldn't do anymore. The Japanese pilot flicked his control stick, trying to get around the Hellcat's tail. But the Hellcat wasn't the clumsy Wildcat from earlier in the war. This fighter was a new breed, faster to respond, more precise in its movements. Tommy gave a slight push on the throttle, adjusting the Hellcat's angle just enough to bring his guns into alignment. Time seemed to stretch as Tommy adjusted his sights, waiting for that perfect moment. He could hear the pounding of his heart, feel the sweat trickling down his neck. This was it. The Zero closed in. Tommy's thumb hovered over the trigger. Now, he whispered to himself. A burst of 50 caliber machine guns erupted from the Hellcat's wings. The sound was deafening, the recoil almost comforting in its familiarity. The Zero jerked violently, chunks of its fuselage torn away by the deadly hail of bullets. Tommy watched as the enemy aircraft spiraled uncontrollably, trailing smoke as it fell from the sky. A flash of orange fire erupted from the cockpit, and the Zero was gone. The Hellcat's engine roared as it climbed again, Tommy's breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He had done it. He had taken down a Zero, the untouchable aircraft that had struck fear into pilots for years. But the fight wasn't over. More Zeros were incoming, their pilots undeterred, believing that they could still fight their way to victory. Tommy's adrenaline surged again, pushing aside the brief euphoria of the kill. He checked his gauges quickly, his fingers moving instinctively over the controls. He was still flying. His Hellcat was still in the fight. The next Zero appeared before him, this time coming in low, trying to cut across his flight path. Tommy didn't hesitate. He pulled hard on the stick, dropping the nose of his Hellcat and snapping it into a hard dive, forcing the enemy to overshoot. The Zero pilot had no choice but to pull hard into a climb. Tommy took advantage of the opening and pounded the trigger again. The burst of machine gun fire cut through the air. The Zero exploded in a blaze of fire and debris, plummeting to the ocean below. But as the second kill fell, Tommy's eyes went to the sky above. The skies were full of smoke trails, fire, and falling debris. The Zero's legend was unraveling in front of him. The myth of invincibility was fading, and Tommy knew it. He could feel it in the air, a shift in the battle that had been building for months, 1-0 at a time. This wasn't just a kill. It was the beginning of a new era of aerial warfare. As the last of the Zeros were shot down, Tommy's squadron returned to base. The sky was clear, but the weight of the day's events settled over Tommy. He had just helped witness the collapse of a myth, the unraveling of the Zero's mystique. the once fearsome aircraft were no longer the dominant force in the sky. He thought back to the first time he'd heard the stories of the Japanese Zero, the aircraft that could outrun, outmaneuver, and outfight any Allied plane. And now, after today, it was no longer the dominant predator of the Pacific. It had been brought down by the Hellcat's firepower, its endurance, and most importantly, its pilot's determination. Tommy leaned back in his cockpit, staring out across the horizon. They had won today, but he knew the war wasn't over. The myth had died today, but there were still battles to fight. And the Hellcat's true dominance was only beginning to take flight. By the time the F-6F Hellcat had made its mark in the skies above the Pacific, the tide of the war was shifting. But this wasn't just a story of faster, more powerful fighters outpacing an old foe. It was about America's industrial might, its ability to adapt, and its relentless determination to break the Japanese grip on the skies. The Hellcat's superiority was the culmination of years of effort, from refined tactics to the industrial machine that churned out the aircraft at an astonishing rate. In the battle between the Hellcat and the Zero, it wasn't just the planes in the sky that mattered. It was the system behind them, logistics, production, and strategy. This was the backbone that would determine the victor. The U.S. military-industrial complex was already a well-oiled machine, pumping out weapons, equipment, and aircraft at a speed that Japan simply couldn't match. While the Japanese fighters, including the Zero, were still made from aging materials, limited resources, and small-scale production lines, the Americans were building fighters like the Hellcat, with unmatched speed and efficiency. America's aircraft production was now an assembly line of mass production, and the Hellcat's design reflected this industrial efficiency. The F-6F Hellcat, with its sturdier airframe and powerful engine, was not just an aircraft, it was the product of an industrial revolution in warfare. By 1944, America had already manufactured over 10,000 Hellcats, and the Japanese were still struggling to replace their dwindling fleet of Zeros. One of the Hellcat's most crucial advantages was its supply chain. The United States had learned from early mistakes in the war. For instance, the loss of early battles, particularly at the start of the Pacific War, taught the Americans that they needed a more reliable aircraft, one that could withstand battle damage, survive the long distances over the Pacific, and come back in a timely fashion. So, the Hellcat was designed to be not only a fearsome weapon in the air, but also a durable workhorse that could be quickly repaired and put back into combat. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpit, and reinforced wings made it a much more survivable aircraft than its predecessors. But beyond its sturdiness, it was the speed at which it could be replaced that tipped the scales. For every Zero shot down, Detroit could deliver a replacement Hellcat in a matter of weeks, whereas Japan couldn't produce a new Mitsubishi A6M0 fast enough to replenish its forces. The Zero's limitations became painfully clear in the months following its first encounters with the Hellcat. The lightweight design of the Zero, while excellent for agility, made it fragile in combat. A single bullet from the Hellcats, the 50 caliber machine guns, could rip through its thin fuselage, rendering it incapable of flight. Additionally, the Zero's range was a significant disadvantage. With its small fuel tank, the Zero was designed for close-range dogfights but struggled on long-range missions, especially as it needed to engage in combat far from its bases. By contrast, the Hellcat's larger fuel tank and improved engine allowed it to stay in the fight longer, and as a result, the Allied forces could maintain air superiority during longer engagements. The Zero, despite its renowned agility, was no longer able to match the Hellcat in terms of sustainability. It was a fighter designed for quick victory, but with the Hellcat's increased range and firepower, the Japanese were now fighting on the back foot. In terms of production, Japan's inability to keep pace with the United States proved devastating. Even though Japan initially outnumbered the United States in terms of the sheer number of Zeros in the Pacific, the U.S. was constantly replacing its losses, while Japan struggled with severe material shortages. As the battle in the skies continued, the Zero's numbers began to dwindle. Meanwhile, the Hellcat's superiority was becoming undeniable. American pilots began to feel the impact of their newfound confidence. The Hellcat's 6,000-pound weight and higher engine performance allowed it to handle well in high-speed turns, unlike the Zero, which was built for dogfights in tighter spaces. The U.S. Navy adapted its tactics accordingly, using its Hellcats in groups, overwhelming the Zeros with coordinated formations that exploited the Hellcat's durability and firepower. But the decisive factor wasn't just in how the Hellcat outclassed the Zero in combat. The American advantage was also rooted in the flexibility and adaptability of U.S. military doctrine. The Navy didn't simply rely on brute force, it adapted its tactics to the changing realities of the war. Carrier-based aircraft, like the Hellcat, were coordinated to act as part of a larger force. These planes didn't fight in isolation. They were part of a highly integrated system of logistics, aircraft maintenance, and coordinated combat operations. This systematic approach to war, combined with the Hellcat's combat capability, began to systematically dismantle the Japanese air superiority. Meanwhile, Japan was facing severe resource depletion. The Imperial Navy's lack of fuel, combined with diminishing reserves of experienced pilots, meant that Japan's most skilled Zero pilots were quickly running out of steam. As the war dragged on, the Japanese failed to replace losses as quickly as the United States did. A lack of trained pilots compounded the problem. Many of the best Japanese pilots had been lost in earlier battles, and their replacements were often green, inexperienced, and lacking the tactical acumen needed to compete with seasoned Hellcat pilots. This stark contrast between the American and Japanese air forces was critical. While American pilots had the advantage of modern training programs and superior aircraft, Japanese pilots were being thrown into battle with fewer resources and less support, making them more vulnerable. But perhaps the most telling factor was the American ability to mass-produce the Hellcat. The scale at which the United States was able to produce aircraft, replace losses, and repair damaged planes was staggering. As Hellcat squadrons continued to increase in number, Japan was left with a diminishing supply of aircraft and pilots. The sustained output of the American war machine, the sheer scale of its industrial capacity, played a significant role in turning the tide of the war. While Japan had focused on producing individual weapons of impressive technical design, America's military-industrial complex focused on creating a constant supply of aircraft, bombs, fuel, and ammunition, ensuring that the Allied forces would always have more resources at their disposal. The U.S. Navy's ability to adapt in terms of aircraft production, tactics, and logistics ultimately proved decisive in the defeat of the Japanese Zero. The Hellcat's superior design, coupled with America's overwhelming industrial capability, shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. As each new Hellcat entered the fray, the Zero's days were numbered. This wasn't just a fight between two planes. It was a battle between two systems, one that could adapt, evolve, and maintain overwhelming pressure, and another that, despite its early success, was hindered by resources and outdated tactics. In the end, the Hellcat didn't just beat the Zero in combat. It became the symbol of America's industrial dominance in the war. The tide had irrevocably turned, and the Allied victory was no longer a matter of if, but when. The battle over the skies of the Pacific had been relentless. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had held its place as the supreme predator in the air, feared by Allied pilots for its unrivaled agility and speed. But as the war raged on, the Zero's aura of invincibility began to crack, and the catalyst for its downfall was the F-6F Hellcat. In the sweltering heat of October 1944, the Japanese were still holding onto the belief that their Zero was an untouchable force, capable of outmaneuvering anything the Americans threw at it. Japanese pilots still trained with the firm conviction that they would outlast the Hellcat, that their aircraft, the Zero, would prevail as it always had. But the reality was much darker than their expectations. In the cockpit of the Hellcat, Lieutenant Alan Al Henderson had already faced off against the Zero more times than he cared to count. He had watched, from the moment of his first encounter, as the once feared Zero became more and more vulnerable. The initial shock of encountering the Zero's speed and agility had given way to something different. The Hellcat's relentless firepower, its durability, and its superior range began to make the Zero seem like a relic from a bygone era. What had once been an unstoppable force was now slowly becoming a broken myth, the myth that no American fighter could touch the Zero in a dogfight. The turning point came with the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Zero's superiority was put to the test against massive Allied air superiority. The Japanese had hoped that their fighters could once again overwhelm the American forces, but the Hellcats were now part of a well-organized, unrelenting aerial assault. With each passing day, more and more Zeros fell from the sky, their wings riddled with bullets, their pilots falling to the relentless firepower of the Hellcats. As the Hellcats swept through the skies, the Japanese pilots began to realize something profound. The Zero, once considered the undisputed champion of the Pacific, was no longer invincible. In midair, with a Hellcat bearing down on them, the Zero's famous agility was rendered useless. The Hellcat's heavier, more stable frame allowed it to keep a steady lock on the enemy, delivering punishing bursts of 50 caliber fire before the Zero could even complete its evasive maneuvers. What had once been the mighty predator was now becoming prey, and the once feared Zero was being slowly whittled away by the American fighter pilots. The collapse of the Zero's myth was cerebral as much as it was physical. For Japanese pilots, it wasn't just the fact that they were losing more Zeros, it was the realization that their tactics, honed over years of dominance, were no longer effective. They had grown accustomed to thinking of the Zero as the ultimate weapon in the sky, an aircraft that could dominate its opponents with speed and agility. But the Hellcat's greater endurance, its ability to absorb damage and keep flying, and most importantly, its relentless firepower, had exposed the Zero's fatal flaws. In the cockpit of a Zero, the initial signs of panic began to take root. The confidence the Japanese pilots once held in their aircraft was slipping away. They could no longer rely on their speed and agility to carry them through dogfights. They could no longer count on their legendary evasive maneuvers to save them. The American Hellcat had rendered these once deadly tricks obsolete. The moment a Zero pilot locked onto a Hellcat, they faced a hard truth. They couldn't outrun the Hellcat, and they couldn't outgun it either. If they tried to make a quick pass, they risked getting blasted apart by the Hellcat's superior firepower. And if they tried to engage in the dogfighting tactics that had worked for them in the past, they soon found themselves at a disadvantage. For the Japanese pilots, this was a shattering realization. The myth of the Zero, the mighty machine that could never be beaten, was no longer the truth. The collapse of this myth was swift and unforgiving. It wasn't just the number of aircraft lost. It was the psychological blow to the morale of the Japanese forces. They had believed that the Zero would carry them to victory, but now it had become clear that the Hellcat had taken the throne. The confidence that had fueled the Zero's myth was replaced with doubt and fear. The once imposing roar of the Zero's engine was now a symbol of defeat in the skies. For the Allies, the collapse of the Zero's myth was a moment of unparalleled victory. They had watched for years as the Japanese fighter reigned supreme. They had endured countless losses to the Zero, and now, in the span of just a few months, the mighty Zero was being knocked out of the sky with increasing regularity. The Hellcat had not only proved itself as a superior fighter in terms of raw performance, but had also served as a symbol of the shift in power in the Pacific. The Zero's myth died in the skies above the Pacific, but its collapse didn't just mark the end of a fighter, it marked the beginning of the end for Japan's hopes of victory. The psychological effect of losing the Zero's reputation was just as important as the physical damage inflicted on their forces. Once the Zero was exposed as vulnerable, Japan's entire aerial strategy unraveled. With the Hellcat now in control of the skies, the Japanese military was forced to retreat, its air power crippled, and its ability to fight back diminished. By the time the U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Okinawa in 1945, the Japanese knew that they no longer had an answer to the Hellcat. The collapse of the Zero's myth had sealed Japan's fate. The once feared aircraft was now nothing more than a symbol of what could have been. The Hellcat, America's fighting spirit, and its unyielding industrial might, had torn down the myth, and with it, any hope Japan had of ever winning the war in the Pacific. The Zero was finished, and with it, so too was Japan's air superiority. The myth had died, and the Hellcat had proven the truth. By the time the F-6F Hellcat had decisively turned the tide in the Pacific, the Zero's myth was in ruins. The invincible fighter aircraft, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was now a symbol of past failures, the reality of Japan's dwindling air power becoming more evident with each passing day. The Hellcat's superiority over the Zero didn't just end a combat rivalry, it shattered Japan's hope of regaining control of the skies and marked the beginning of the end for Japan's aerial dominance. The legacy of the Zero was built on fear and psychological warfare. In the early stages of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was nearly untouchable. Its incredible maneuverability and speed made it the apex predator of the skies, striking fear into the hearts of Allied pilots. The Zero's reputation had been established through its stunning victories, its pilots' unmatched skill, and the aircraft's supreme agility. The myth surrounding the Zero was more than just its capabilities. It was a symbol of Japan's technological prowess and military superiority. However, the Hellcat's arrival marked the end of that myth. The American fighter was more than just an improvement on previous models. It was a paradigm shift in aerial combat. While the Zero was still a formidable opponent in skilled hands, the Hellcat was designed not just to fight but to survive. Its durable airframe, superior weaponry, and longer operational range made it the perfect counter to the Zero's agility. Hellcat pilots no longer feared the Zero's speed, as the Hellcat was built to outgun and outlast its Japanese counterpart. In the skies above the Philippines and Leyte Gulf, where the battle for air supremacy was decisively lost by the Japanese, the shift in air power became undeniable. With each Zero shot down, the myth of invincibility disintegrated. By the time Iwo Jima and Okinawa saw combat, the Japanese pilots knew their once feared aircraft was no longer the terror it once was. Zero pilots began to acknowledge that their tactics, once the hallmark of Japanese aerial superiority, were now ineffective against the Hellcat's firepower and advanced training. What had been a symbol of strength had become a symbol of defeat. For the Allied forces, the Hellcat's success was a testament to the power of American industrial capacity and military strategy. In less than a year, the Hellcat had become the cornerstone of U.S. naval air superiority, destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft and bringing down the Zero's myth in a way that no single fighter could. The Hellcat was not only a product of superior engineering, but also the result of vast logistical support, a fighter designed to be mass-produced and constantly replenished, an aircraft that could take damage, return to base, and keep fighting. This cycle of endless production, combined with the Navy's highly trained pilots, overwhelmed the Japanese forces, who could no longer keep up with the pace of loss. The Japanese military had relied on their precious resources, which included the limited number of Zero fighters and their severe production limits. Unlike the United States, which could mass-produce aircraft at an astonishing rate, Japan struggled to replenish its losses. As the war dragged on, the lack of fuel, shortages in raw materials, and a shortage of experienced pilots left Japan unable to keep pace with the Americans. The Zero, once seen as a weapon capable of challenging entire fleets, had become obsolete in the face of overwhelming American production capabilities. For Japan, the collapse of the Zero myth was a turning point in more than just aviation. The loss of its air superiority marked the beginning of its ultimate defeat in the Pacific. The Zero's reputation was irrevocably tarnished, and Japan's military strategy was rendered ineffective. The once feared aircraft had become just another target in the sky, no different from the other Japanese aircraft that would soon be wiped out by the advancing American forces. By the time the Hellcat had secured victory, Japan's war effort was in ruins, its air forces shattered, and its hopes of victory in the Pacific now all but gone. For the U.S. military, the Hellcat's legacy was undeniable. It wasn't just the number of kills or victories it racked up. It was the symbol of American resilience and industrial might. The Hellcat, combined with the P-51 Mustang and the B-29 Superfortress, was the spearhead of the Allied victory in the Pacific. It was a fighter that wasn't just built for dogfights but for long-term air supremacy. American production lines continued to crank out thousands of aircraft, ensuring the Allies would maintain dominance in the air and overwhelm the Japanese forces. As Japan's military capability collapsed, the Hellcat's role in ensuring that the Allied forces maintained air superiority was key to the final stages of the Pacific War. The U.S. victory in the skies directly contributed to the successful invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which would eventually lead to Japan's surrender in 1945. The Hellcat's success and the subsequent destruction of the Zero wasn't just a tactical win, it was a turning point in the war that ended Japan's hope of victory. The Hellcat's legacy was more than just its role in the destruction of the Zero. It was a representation of American ingenuity and perseverance. The Zero's collapse marked a psychological and tactical victory for the Allies. It was no longer just a fight for survival, but the beginning of final victory over an enemy who had once seemed invincible. And as the war in the Pacific came to a close, the Hellcat's triumph stood as a testament to the power of adaptation, resilience, and the industrial might that defined the Allied forces in World War II.